The call came at 2:47 a.m. My cousin Trevor's voice was panicked as he told me Uncle Harold had collapsed at home and was in critical condition at Desert Valley Medical Center. I abandoned everything: my architectural firm in Denver, my award-winning downtown loft, my future, and maxed out 3 credit cards for the first available flight to Phoenix. For 23 years, Aunt Claudia had made it crystal clear that I wasn't really family, that I was just the orphaned niece they'd been stuck with out of obligation. But when I arrived at that hospital and found no record of Harold Brennan ever being admitted, I knew this desperate midnight summons wasn't about family loyalty. It was about the $12.4 million inheritance from my grandfather that was set to transfer to me in exactly 2 weeks. They'd fabricated a medical emergency to drag me back into their web, but their mistake wasn't the elaborate lie. It was assuming I was still the grateful, dependent girl who'd left their house 6 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The shrill ring of my phone pierced through my Denver apartment's silence, jolting me from the deep sleep I desperately needed after pulling an all-nighter on the Morrison Building project. I fumbled for the device, squinting at the screen through bleary eyes. Trevor Brennan. My cousin had never called me, not once in the 6 years since I'd left Phoenix. Isabel? His voice was breathless, almost frantic. Thank God you answered. It's Uncle Harold. He's had some kind of cardiac episode. The paramedics just took him to Desert Valley Medical. It's really bad, Izzy. The childhood nickname hit me like a slap. Nobody had called me Izzy since I'd left Arizona, since I'd stopped being the charity case living in their guest room and became Isabel Rivera, licensed architect with my own firm. What happened? I sat up, instantly alert despite the exhaustion weighing down my limbs. Trevor's voice cracked with what sounded like genuine terror. He just collapsed during dinner. Mom found him on the kitchen floor. The doctors aren't sure he's going to make it through the night. He was asking for you before they sedated him. Harold asking for me? That seemed impossible. My uncle had barely acknowledged my existence when I lived under his roof, treating me like an unwelcome reminder of his wife's deceased sister, my mother. I'll be on the next flight, I heard myself saying, already moving toward my laptop to check airline schedules. Hurry, Isabel, please. I know things have been complicated with the family, but he needs you here. After hanging up, I stood frozen in my apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the Denver glittering skyline. The city had become my sanctuary, my proof that I could build something meaningful from nothing. Rivera Architectural Design was finally gaining recognition. I'd just been featured in Architectural Digest as one of the rising stars under 30. Everything I'd worked for was finally coming together. But Harold was family. The only father figure I'd ever known, even if he'd kept me at arm's length. Within an hour, I was throwing clothes into a suitcase, my hands shaking as I called my business partner to explain the emergency. The only available flight to Phoenix departed in 4 hours and cost more than my monthly rent. I didn't hesitate to charge it to my credit card. As the plane lifted off, memories of my complicated relationship with the Brennan family flooded back. After my parents died in that car crash when I was 7, Aunt Claudia had taken me in. Not out of love, but out of obligation. She'd made that abundantly clear from day one. She's not really family, I'd overheard her tell her bridge club when I was 10, her voice carrying from the kitchen into the hallway where I'd been eavesdropping. Antonio was my sister's husband, not blood, but what choice did we have? She had nowhere else to go. That conversation had shaped my understanding of my place in their household. I was the outsider, the burden, the girl who ate their food and wore hand-me-downs from neighbors, while Trevor and Natasha got new clothes for every school year. Harold had been different, not warm exactly, but not openly hostile like Claudia. He'd helped me with math homework sometimes, taught me to change a tire, and had quietly supported my college applications when Claudia insisted I should learn a practical trade instead of chasing impossible dreams. The plane touched down in Phoenix just as the sun was rising over the desert landscape I'd once called home. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, less imposing than the mountains that once seemed to trap me in the valley. Trevor was waiting at baggage claim, his usually perfect appearance disheveled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his expensive shirt was wrinkled. At 26, he'd grown into the kind of polished businessman Harold had always wanted him to become, but today he looked genuinely shaken. "Thank you for coming," he said, embracing me awkwardly. "I wasn't sure you would." "How is he?" I asked immediately, scanning his face for clues.
"Stable, but critical. The doctors are keeping him sedated while they run more tests." Trevor grabbed my suitcase and started walking toward the exit. "Mom's been at the hospital all night. Natasha flew in from San Francisco this morning." The whole family gathering. That should have been my first red flag. We drove through Phoenix in uncomfortable silence, past strip malls and subdivisions that had multiplied since my last visit. I noticed several billboards advertising Brennan Strategic Advisors, my uncle's consulting firm that had grown significantly over the years. "Business looks good," I observed, nodding toward one of the advertisements. Trevor's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Dad's worked really hard to build the company. We've expanded into commercial real estate consultation, investment advisory services. It's been a major growth period." Something in his tone made me glance at him more closely. Despite his words, he didn't look like someone whose family business was thriving. There was tension in his jaw, a careful quality to his responses that reminded me of the way he used to lie to Harold about his grades in high school. When we pulled into the hospital parking lot, I was surprised to see Claudia's silver Mercedes alongside several other expensive cars I didn't recognize. For a family keeping vigil during a medical crisis, there seemed to be quite a crowd. "Who else is here?" I asked. "Just family and close friends," Trevor said vaguely. Everyone wanted to show support. Desert Valley Medical Center was a sprawling complex that had been expanded several times since my childhood. Trevor led me confidently through the maze of corridors, suggesting he'd been here many times recently. We took the elevator to the cardiac care unit, where I expected to find Harold hooked up to machines, fighting for his life. Instead, when we approached the nurse's station, the charge nurse looked confused when Trevor asked about Harold Brennan's condition. "I'm sorry," she said, checking her computer system twice. "We don't have any patient by that name admitted to this unit. Are you sure about the spelling?" The world seemed to tilt sideways. Trevor's face went pale, then red. "That's impossible. He was brought in last night. Cardiac episode, room 314. "Sir, room 314 has been empty since Tuesday. We haven't admitted anyone named Brennan to this floor in the past week." I turned to my cousin, a cold realization washing over me. "Trevor, what's going on?" "There must be some mistake," he stammered, pulling out his phone. "Maybe they moved him to a different floor. Let me call Mom." But I was already walking toward the information desk, my architect's mind cataloging inconsistencies. Trevor's clean clothes, despite supposedly spending the night at the hospital. The lack of grief in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. The careful way he'd avoided specific details about Harold's condition. "Excuse me," I said to the volunteer at the information desk. "Can you check if Harold Brennan has been admitted to any unit in this hospital in the past 24 hours? The elderly woman smiled kindly and typed into her system. After a moment, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, dear, no one by that name has been admitted recently." Trevor appeared at my elbow, his phone still pressed to his ear. "Mom's not answering," he said weakly. I fixed him with a stare that made him flinch. "That's because she's not sitting by Harold's bedside in the ICU, is she? Because Harold isn't here, because he was never here." My cousin's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Isabel, I can explain." "Then start explaining, right now, or I swear I'll cause a scene in this lobby that you'll never forget."
Trevor glanced around at the curious faces watching our exchange, then grabbed my arm. "Not here. Let's go to the car." I jerked away from his touch. "Don't you dare put your hands on me. Tell me the truth. Is Harold even sick?" He had some chest pains yesterday. Nothing serious. We may have exaggerated the situation." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. 6 years of building a life away from their manipulation, and they dragged me back with lies. "You faked a medical emergency to get me here? We needed you to come home, Izzy. It's important. It's about the family. Don't call me Izzy, and don't talk to me about family. I'm getting the next flight back to Denver. Wait. Trevor's voice was desperate now. You can't leave. Not now. The inheritance. Grandpa's trust matures in 2 weeks. We need to talk about it. All of us. Together. And there it was. The real reason for this elaborate charade. My grandfather, Antonio Rivera's trust, established before his death 3 years ago, was finally going to transfer to me on my 30th birthday. I'd known it was coming, but I'd assumed it was a modest sum, maybe enough for a down payment on a house or to expand my business. But the panic in Trevor's eyes suggested it was much more than that, enough to justify fabricating a medical emergency, enough to drag me back to the family that had never wanted me in the first place. How much? I asked quietly. Trevor wouldn't meet my eyes. We should discuss this with everyone, at the house, as a family. We're not family, remember? Your mother made that very clear. The drive to the Brennan house was tense and silent. I stared out the window at the familiar neighborhoods, my mind racing. Whatever was in that trust, it was significant enough to make them desperate. And if there was one thing I'd learned from living with the Brennans, it's that desperate people were dangerous people. The house looked exactly the same, a sprawling ranch-style home in an exclusive Scottsdale neighborhood with the perfectly manicured desert landscaping that had always seemed more like a museum display than a place where people actually lived. But as we pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed several luxury cars parked outside, a black BMW, a white Lexus, and a silver Audi I didn't recognize. Quite a crowd for a family meeting, I observed. Trevor parked and turned to me, his expression pleading. Isabel, I know this looks bad, but you have to understand. We really do need your help. The business, the family, everything depends on it. I climbed out of the car without responding, my heels clicking on the brick walkway as we approached the front door. Whatever was waiting for me inside, I was no longer the naive girl who'd left this house 6 years ago. I'd built a successful business from nothing, navigated corporate boardrooms, and earned the respect of clients who initially dismissed me because of my age and gender. If my aunt and her family thought they could manipulate me the way they had when I was young and dependent on them, they were about to get a very unpleasant surprise. The game was just beginning, and this time, I intended to win.
I walked into the Brennan house ahead of Trevor, following the sound of voices toward the living room. What I found wasn't a family gathering around a hospital vigil, but what looked more like a business meeting. Aunt Claudia sat in her usual throne-like chair, perfectly dressed in a cream-colored suit despite supposedly spending the night at a hospital. Her silver hair was styled to perfection, her makeup flawless. This was not the appearance of a woman who'd been crying over her husband's deathbed. Natasha looked up from her laptop as I entered, her expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been guilt. My younger cousin had inherited Claudia's sharp features and calculating eyes, but none of her mother's ability to mask her emotions. At 24, she'd already made a name for herself in San Francisco's tech scene, though she'd always maintained she was too busy to visit family. Harold stood by the window with a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, looking as robust and healthy as I'd ever seen him. When he saw me, he had the decency to look embarrassed, setting down his drink and moving toward me with arms outstretched. "Isabel, sweetheart, you came!" I stepped back, avoiding his embrace. Don't you dare pretend this is a happy reunion." The room fell silent. Claudia's eyes narrowed as she took in my appearance, the expensive tailored blazer, the confidence I carried now, the way I held myself like someone who belonged in boardrooms rather than begging for scraps. "Isabel," she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of disapproval, "you look different." "I look successful," I replied evenly, which apparently comes as a surprise to you. Harold cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should all sit down, have some coffee. We can explain everything." "I don't want coffee. I want an explanation. Now."
I remained standing, using every inch of my 5'7" frame to project authority. You lied to get me here. You made me think Harold was dying. Why? The family exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that comes from years of conspiracy. It was Claudia who finally spoke, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I remembered so well. We needed you to come home, Isabel. There are important family matters to discuss, and we couldn't do it over the phone. Family matters? I laughed, the sound sharp in the elegant living room. That's rich, coming from the woman who spent 13 years making it clear I wasn't really family. Claudia's composure cracked slightly. That's not fair. We took you in when you had nowhere else to go. We gave you a home, an education. You gave me a roof and reminded me every day that I should be grateful for it. You made me feel like a charity case, like I was stealing food from your children's mouths every time I ate dinner at your table. We did the best we could, Harold interjected, but his voice lacked conviction. Did you? Because I distinctly remember overhearing Claudia tell Mrs. Patterson that I was just the Mexican girl she was stuck with because of some misguided obligation to her dead sister. Natasha winced. Even she looked uncomfortable with that particular memory. That was a long time ago, Claudia said stiffly. People change. Perspectives evolve. Do they? Because 24 hours ago, you were perfectly content to never see me again. What changed? What could possibly be so important that you'd fabricate a medical emergency? The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths. It was Trevor who finally broke, unable to maintain the pretense any longer. It's about Grandpa Antonio's trust. It transfers to you in 2 weeks. I had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through me. And we need to discuss your plans for the inheritance, Harold said, attempting to regain control of the conversation. As a family. Plans? I turned to face him fully. It's my inheritance. I don't need to discuss my plans with anyone. But surely you understand, Claudia said, leaning forward with the predatory smile I remembered from my childhood. That money comes with responsibilities to the family, to the business your uncle built. There it was, the real reason for the charade. Not concern for my well-being, not a desire to reconnect with family, but money. My money. How much are we talking about? I asked, curious to see if they'd be honest about the amount. Another exchange of glances. This time it was a man I hadn't noticed before who spoke up. Someone sitting in the corner with a briefcase full of documents. I'm Leonard Cross, the family's attorney. Your grandfather's trust, including the property holdings, investment portfolios, and liquid assets, is valued at approximately $12.4 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd known Grandpa Antonio had been successful with his construction company, but I'd never imagined this kind of wealth. No wonder they were so desperate. That's a substantial amount, Cross continued, and it comes with certain opportunities for strategic investment. Strategic investment in what? Though I already knew the answer.
Brandon Strategic Advisors has several exciting ventures that would benefit from a significant capital infusion, Harold said, his businessman persona sliding back into place. As family, we thought you might want to be involved in— Stop. I held up my hand. Just stop talking. I walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured backyard where I'd spent countless hours as a child, feeling like an outsider looking in. The pool where Trevor and Natasha had pool parties I was never invited to. The patio where Claudia entertained her friends and introduced me as Antonio's daughter, with a tone that made it clear I was a burden rather than a blessing. $12.4 million, I said slowly, letting the words hang in the air. That's why you suddenly care about family. That's why I'm not just the Mexican girl anymore. That's why Harold was supposedly dying and you needed me here immediately. Isabel, that's not fair, Trevor started, but I cut him off. Isn't it? For 6 years, I've lived in Denver. 6 years without a single phone call asking how I was doing, without an invitation to holidays or birthdays or any of the family gatherings I see posted on your social media accounts. I turned back to face them, my voice growing stronger. But the moment my inheritance becomes available, suddenly I'm family again. Suddenly you care. Claudia's mask slipped completely then, revealing the calculating woman I'd always known her to be. Don't be naive, Isabel. Family means supporting each other. Your grandfather's money could help secure everyone's future, not just yours. My grandfather's money? I repeated. The grandfather who left it to me specifically. Not to the family business, not to Harold's consulting firm, to me. But surely you see the wisdom in keeping family wealth within the family, Harold said. Brennan's strategic advisors could use the capital to expand, to create opportunities for everyone. Including opportunities to pay off whatever debts you've accumulated, I asked, reading between the lines. Because that's what this is really about, isn't it? You're not successful entrepreneurs looking for investment partners. You're desperate people who need my money to save whatever mess you've gotten yourselves into. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. No one denied it. Business has been challenging, Harold admitted carefully. The economic climate, increased competition, some investments that didn't pan out as expected. How bad is it? I pressed. Nothing that can't be addressed with proper capitalization, Cross interjected. But his lawyer's non-answer told me everything I needed to know. I looked around the room at these people who had shaped my childhood with their conditional love and constant reminders that I didn't belong, the same people who now needed me more than I ever needed them. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice calm and professional. I'm going back to my hotel. I'm going to think about what you've told me, and in a few days, I'll let you know my decision about the inheritance. Isabel, please, Natasha spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. We're still family despite everything. Are we? I met her eyes. Because 24 hours ago, your mother wouldn't have crossed the street to spit on me if I was on fire. But now that I have something you need, suddenly I'm family again? I started toward the door, then paused and turned back. One more question. If I hadn't inherited this money, would any of you have ever contacted me again? The silence was answer enough. That's what I thought. And I walked out of the house where I'd never truly belonged, leaving behind a family that had only ever seen me as either a burden or an opportunity, never as a person worth loving for her own sake. As I called a taxi to take me to a hotel, I realized that for the first time in my life, I held all the cards in this family dynamic. The question was, what was I going to do with that power?
The Ritz-Carlton in downtown Phoenix was everything the Brennan house wasn't. Elegant without being cold, luxurious without being ostentatious. I checked into a suite that cost more than my childhood allowance for an entire year. And for the first time since landing in Phoenix, I felt like I could breathe. I poured myself a glass of wine from the minibar and sat on the balcony, looking out at the city lights while I processed what had just happened. $12.4 million. The number kept echoing in my mind, along with the desperate look in Harold's eyes and the calculating expression on Claudia's face. My phone buzzed with text messages that I ignored. Trevor, Natasha, even Harold, all suddenly very interested in maintaining communication now that they needed something from me. The irony wasn't lost on me that in 23 years of living, they'd never been this eager to hear from me. I opened my laptop and started researching Brennan's strategic advisors, something I probably should have done years ago. What I found painted a picture that explained everything about this afternoon's performance. The company had grown rapidly over the past 5 years, expanding from Harold's modest financial consulting practice into commercial real estate, investment advisory services, and business acquisitions. On the surface, it looked impressive. Sleek website, professional headshots of the team, testimonials from satisfied clients. But when I dug deeper, using the investigative skills I developed during my architecture career to research contractors and suppliers, red flags began emerging. Several lawsuits from clients claiming misrepresented returns, a Better Business Bureau rating that had declined steadily over the past 2 years, online reviews that ranged from glowing to absolutely scathing with very little middle ground. Most telling was a recent article in the Phoenix Business Journal about rising concerns in local investment firms. While Brennan's strategic advisors wasn't named directly, the description of a firm that had overextended its reach and potentially overpromised returns to clients sounded remarkably familiar. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. Isabel Rivera? Speaking.
This is Mrs. Vivian Ashford. I live next door to the Brennan family. I was wondering if you might have time for coffee tomorrow morning. I frowned. The name was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I'm sorry, do we know each other? You probably don't remember me, dear. I moved in when you were about 15, but I remember you quite well. You used to sit by our shared fence and read books. I always wanted to invite you over, but... She trailed off diplomatically. But Claudia would have had a fit. I finished the thought silently. I have some things I think you should know about your family's recent activities, things that might be relevant to your current situation. The way she phrased it suggested she knew exactly why I was back in town. How do you know about my current situation? Honey, the walls in that neighborhood are thin, and Claudia's voice carries. I've been watching this train wreck build up steam for months. Someone needs to warn you before you get caught in the wreckage. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near her house the next morning. After hanging up, I stared out at the Phoenix skyline, wondering what other secrets were waiting to be uncovered. I spent the rest of the evening diving deeper into public records, using my professional network to access databases that might reveal more about Brennan's strategic advisor's financial health. What I found was deeply troubling. The company had taken on massive debt to fund their expansion. Property records showed they'd mortgaged and remortgaged several commercial buildings. Court filings revealed ongoing disputes with contractors and suppliers. Most concerning were the incorporation records, showing a web of subsidiary companies and LLCs that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify their business operations. By midnight, I had compiled a folder of documents that painted a picture of a company in serious financial distress. No wonder they needed my inheritance. The question was, how desperate were they, and exactly what had they done to get themselves into this position? The next morning, I drove through my old neighborhood toward the coffee shop, passing houses where I'd babysat as a teenager to earn spending money that Claudia said built character, but never seemed to provide. The Ashford house sat adjacent to the Brennan property, a modest ranch-style home with a beautiful garden that I remembered admiring during my solitary afternoons reading by the fence. Mrs. Ashford was waiting in a corner booth. A woman in her 70s with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She rose to hug me as I approached, the first genuine warmth I had experienced since arriving in Phoenix. "You've grown into such a lovely young woman," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "I've followed your career online. Your architecture firm has received some wonderful recognition." I was touched that she'd kept track of my life when my own family hadn't. "Thank you. You said you had information about the Brennan—"
Her expression grew serious. "Isabel, I need you to understand that I'm not a gossip. I'm a retired accountant, and what I'm going to tell you comes from professional concern, not neighborhood drama." She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. "I've been Claudia's friend for years, or I thought I was. She asked me to help review some financial documents 6 months ago, said she wanted a second opinion on Harold's business ventures." Mrs. Ashford opened the folder, revealing financial statements and investment projections. What I found was alarming. The company has been operating essentially as a Ponzi scheme for the past 2 years. They've been using new investor money to pay returns to earlier investors while living off the excess. The coffee grew cold in my hands as she walked me through the evidence. Phantom properties that existed only on paper, investment funds that had been diverted to pay for the family's lifestyle, client accounts that showed returns that were mathematically impossible given market conditions. "How bad is it?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. "Catastrophic. They're facing bankruptcy within months, possibly criminal charges if the right people start asking questions." She leaned forward. "Isabel, when Claudia asked me to review these documents, she let slip that they were counting on a family windfall to resolve their problems. I believe she was referring to your inheritance. So this has been planned for months, at minimum, possibly longer." Mrs. Ashford's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Your aunt has been telling people in the neighborhood that you're coming home to help save the family business. She's been describing you as the prodigal daughter who finally understands her obligations." The casual manipulation stung, but it didn't surprise me. Claudia had always been adept at rewriting history to suit her narrative.
There's more, Mrs. Ashford continued. I did some checking on my own after Claudia asked for my help. The trust your grandfather established for you, it wasn't just giving you an inheritance. It was specifically designed to be protected from any claims against the family business. I looked up sharply. What do you mean? Your grandfather suspected this might happen. Harold had always been ambitious, sometimes recklessly so. The trust documents I found at the county recorder's office include specific language protecting your inheritance from any debts, judgments, or claims against Brennan Strategic Advisors or any affiliated companies. This was news to me. I'd always assumed the trust was simply my grandfather's way of ensuring I had security, never imagining it was designed as protection against my own family. Antonio was smarter than people gave him credit for, Mrs. Ashford said gently. He loved you, Isabel. I remember him visiting when you were younger, how angry he'd get at the way Claudia treated you. I think he knew that someday you might need protection from them. The revelation hit me harder than I had expected. My grandfather, who had died when I was 27 and building my business in Denver, had been looking out for me even beyond his death. What should I do? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. Mrs. Ashford reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That's not for me to decide, dear, but I will say this. Your grandfather didn't protect that money so you could use it to bail out the people who never appreciated you. He protected it so you could build the life you deserved. As I drove back to the hotel, Mrs. Ashford's words echoed in my mind. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was my grandfather's final gift. His way of ensuring that I would never again be dependent on the family that had treated me like a burden. But knowing the truth about their financial desperation also meant understanding how dangerous the situation had become. People facing criminal charges and bankruptcy weren't likely to give up easily. And if there was one thing I'd learned from growing up with the Brennans, it's that they fought dirty when their backs were against the wall. I had a decision to make. And I was beginning to realize it wasn't just about money. It was about whether I was finally ready to stop being the victim of their manipulation and start being the architect of my own justice.
Back at the hotel, I spread Mrs. Ashford's documents across the desk in my suite, cross-referencing them with what I'd found during my own research. The picture that emerged was worse than I'd imagined. Brennan's Strategic Advisors wasn't just struggling. They were running a sophisticated fraud operation that had been targeting Phoenix's retirees and small business owners for years. My phone buzzed with another call from Trevor, which I ignored. Then came a text. Izzy, please call me back. We need to talk. This doesn't have to be complicated. The casual use of my childhood nickname after years of radio silence made my skin crawl. Everything was always simple to Trevor when he needed something. I blocked his number and continued working. I needed professional help, and I knew exactly who to call. Marcus Webb had been 2 years ahead of me in college, a sharp-minded guy who'd gone into financial crime investigation after graduating with degrees in both accounting and criminal justice. We'd reconnected at our university's alumni mixer in Denver last year, and he'd mentioned that his firm sometimes took on private consulting work. Isabel Rivera, Marcus said when he answered, sounding pleased. This is unexpected. How's the architecture business? Complicated at the moment. Marcus, I need to ask you about something sensitive. Are you available for a private consultation? His tone shifted to professional interest. What kind of consultation? The kind that involves potential financial fraud and family members who might be running a Ponzi scheme. There was a pause. Where are you? Phoenix. I can be there tomorrow morning. Send me everything you've got and I'll review it on the plane. After emailing Marcus the documents, I decided to take a more direct approach to gathering information. I drove to the business district where Brennan Strategic Advisors occupied a gleaming high-rise office building. The directory in the lobby showed they had expanded to take up nearly an entire floor, either a sign of genuine success or an elaborate facade to impress potential investors. I took the elevator to the 15th floor and walked into their reception area, which looked like something from a high-end magazine spread. Expensive artwork, leather furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the Phoenix skyline. Either they were incredibly successful, or they were spending their clients' money on impressive window dressing. "Can I help you?" The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, looked up from her computer with a practiced smile. "I'm here to see Harold Brennan. I'm his niece, Isabel Rivera." Her expression shifted slightly. Surprise, perhaps even recognition. "Oh, Mr. Brennan mentioned you might be stopping by. Let me see if he's available." Interesting. Harold was expecting me, which meant they'd been discussing strategy since yesterday's confrontation. "I'm sorry," she said after a brief phone call. "Mr. Brennan is in meetings all afternoon, but Trevor Brennan has some time available if you'd like to speak with him." "That's fine." Trevor appeared within minutes, looking more polished than he had yesterday, but with the same underlying tension in his eyes. He led me down a hallway lined with photographs of successful projects and satisfied clients, all designed to project success and stability. His office was impressive. Corner location, expensive furniture, diplomas and awards prominently displayed. But I noticed several boxes stacked in the corner, and his desk looked like someone who was either very busy or very disorganized. "I'm glad you came by," Trevor said, settling behind his desk. "I know yesterday was a shock, but I want you to see what we've built here, what your investment could help us expand." "My investment?" I raised an eyebrow. "That's an interesting way to describe my inheritance." "Poor choice of words. I meant your participation in the family business." He gestured around the office. "We've grown tremendously over the past 5 years. We manage over $200 million in client assets. We've completed dozens of successful real estate developments, and we're positioned for major expansion into California and Nevada." I nodded as if impressed, but I was actually cataloging details that contradicted his claims. The boxes in the corner had shipping labels suggesting recent downsizing. Several of the awards on his wall were from organizations I'd never heard of. Most telling, his computer screen showed an email program with what looked like dozens of unread messages with subject lines that included words like overdue, final notice, and urgent. "That sounds impressive," I said. "I'd love to see some of the specific projects you're working on." Trevor's enthusiasm was almost convincing as he pulled out presentation folders and began walking me through various developments and investment opportunities. He showed me glossy brochures for luxury condominiums, commercial properties, and retail complexes. Everything looked professional and legitimate on the surface.
But I'd spent 6 years learning to read architectural plans and financial projections, and several things didn't add up. Construction timelines that seemed unrealistic, profit projections that were impossibly optimistic. Most concerning, several of the completed projects shown in the photographs didn't match the addresses listed in the documentation. "This is all very impressive," I said when he finished his presentation. "Can you show me the actual properties? I'd love to see some of your work in person." Something flickered in Trevor's expression, just for a moment, but I caught it. "Of course. We can arrange site visits. Some are completed and occupied, others are still in development phases. Let's start with the completed ones." "Well, actually, several of our most successful projects are in California, and the local ones are mostly commercial properties that require advance notice for tours." The evasions were getting more elaborate. I decided to push harder. "Trevor, I appreciate the presentation, but I'm going to need more concrete information before considering any kind of financial involvement. Independent audits, client references, detailed financial statements for the past 3 years. His smile became strained. "Of course, I'll have our accountants prepare everything, though I should mention most of our documentation is confidential, client privacy, you understand." "I understand completely, which is why I'll be bringing in my own independent financial investigator to review everything." The color drained from Trevor's face. Is that really necessary? I mean, we're family. Surely there's a level of trust." "Family?" I interrupted. "Trevor, your mother spent years making it clear I wasn't really family. Now you want me to hand over $12 million based on trust and family loyalty? That seems like a significant change in perspective." He was quiet for a moment,
And when he spoke again, his voice had lost its polished salesmanship tone. "Isabel, I know Mom was hard on you when we were kids. That was wrong. But we're adults now, and this is business. Good business that could benefit everyone. Then you won't mind the independent audit. It's just, there are time-sensitive opportunities, deals that won't wait for lengthy investigations. Your inheritance transfers in less than 2 weeks, and we've got investors expecting commitments." There it was. The real timeline pressure wasn't about my birthday. It was about keeping their house of cards from collapsing before they could get their hands on my money. I see. I stood up, gathering the brochures he'd given me. Well, then I suppose we'd better move quickly with that audit. Trevor stood as well, his composure cracking. "Trevor, please, don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. We can work something out that benefits everyone." "I'm sure we can," I said pleasantly. "I'll be in touch once I've had everything reviewed by professionals." As I left the office, I noticed several employees watching me with curious expressions. Either I was the famous niece they'd heard about, or word was already spreading that their company's salvation might not be as guaranteed as they had been told. Back in the elevator, I pulled out my phone and called Marcus again. "Change of plans. I need you here tonight, not tomorrow morning, and bring your full forensic accounting kit. This is bigger than I thought." "How much bigger?" I looked at the brochures Trevor had given me, thinking about the desperate look in his eyes and the carefully constructed lies he tried to sell me. "Big enough that I think my family might be willing to do whatever it takes to get my inheritance, including things that could land them in federal prison. I'll be on the next flight." As I drove back to the hotel, I realized that Mrs. Ashford had been right about one thing. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about stopping my family from destroying more lives with their fraudulent schemes. And if that meant turning them in to the authorities, so be it. After all, they'd taught me long ago that family loyalty was conditional. Now, they were about to learn what happened when those conditions were not met.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Marcus Webb arrived at Phoenix Sky Harbor at 11:30 p.m., carrying 2 laptops and a briefcase that looked like it could survive a nuclear explosion. At 32, he'd developed the sharp, analytical look of someone who spent his days following money trails that people desperately wanted to keep hidden. His reputation in financial crime investigation was impeccable, and more importantly, I trusted him completely. We met in my hotel suite, where I'd converted the living area into a makeshift war room. Documents covered every surface, and I'd printed out everything I'd found during my research. Marcus surveyed the chaos with professional interest. "Tell me you've got coffee," he said, setting down his equipment. "And then tell me why you think your family is running a Ponzi scheme." I poured him coffee from the room service cart and walked him through everything I'd discovered. Mrs. Ashford's documents, the inconsistencies in Trevor's presentation, the red flags from my online research, and, most importantly, the desperate way they'd manipulated me into coming home. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on his tablet. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes, processing the information. "Okay," he said finally. "This has all the hallmarks of investment fraud, but I need to dig deeper before we can be certain. Give me access to your laptop, and let's see what we can find that isn't available to the general public." What Marcus could access with his professional databases and investigative tools was far more comprehensive than my amateur research. Within an hour, he'd painted a picture of systematic fraud that was worse than I'd imagined. "Look at this," he said, turning his laptop screen toward me. "Brennan Strategic Advisors has been shifting money between accounts in a classic shell game pattern. They collect investment funds, move them through multiple subsidiary companies, then use portions to pay returns to earlier investors, while the rest disappears into personal accounts." He pulled up bank records that showed regular transfers to accounts held by Harold, Claudia, Trevor, and even Natasha. "Your family has been living off their clients' money for years.
New cars, luxury vacations, that expensive office space, all funded by what should have been investment capital. How much are we talking about? Marcus's fingers flew across his keyboard, calculating figures from multiple spreadsheets. Based on what I can see here, they've misappropriated at least $8 million over the past 3 years, probably more that's been better hidden. The number made my stomach turn. $8 million stolen from people who trusted Harold with their retirement savings, their children's college funds, their life's work. There's more, Marcus continued grimly. They're not just planning to use your inheritance to continue the scam, they're planning to disappear with it. Look at these offshore account applications, all filed within the past month. My blood ran cold. The accounts were in the Cayman Islands, set up under shell corporations with Harold, Claudia, and Trevor listed as beneficiaries. They weren't just planning to steal my money, they were planning to flee the country with it.
How long before they could execute this plan? Based on the paperwork, the offshore accounts will be fully operational by the end of next week, right around the time your inheritance transfers. The timeline was terrifyingly clear. They'd manipulated me into coming home not just to get access to my inheritance, but to buy themselves time to set up their escape plan. Once they had my money, they'd vanish, leaving their victims with nothing and no way to recover their stolen savings. My phone buzzed with a text from Natasha. "Can we meet for lunch today? Just the two of us? I think there are some things you should know about what's really going on." I showed the message to Marcus, who raised an eyebrow. Interesting timing. Think she's ready to flip on the family? Or it's another manipulation. But something about the message felt different from the others I'd received. Natasha had always been the smartest of my cousins and the least involved in Harold's business operations. Maybe she'd finally figured out what her family was really doing. "Either way, it's an opportunity to gather more information," Marcus said. "But you should wire yourself for the conversation." "Is that legal?" Arizona is a one-party consent state. As long as you're part of the conversation, you can record it legally. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a device no bigger than a button. "This will capture everything clearly, and it transmits to my laptop in real time. If she says anything incriminating, we'll have it on record." 3 hours later, I sat across from Natasha at a quiet cafe in Old Town Scottsdale, the recording device clipped inside my blazer. My cousin looked different than she had 2 days ago, paler, more nervous, and she kept glancing around as if she expected someone to be watching us. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure you would." "What did you want to talk about, Natasha?" She took a shaky breath. "I need to tell you what's really happening with the family business, and I need to warn you about what Mom and Dad are planning to do if you don't give them your inheritance." The recording device captured every word as Natasha began to speak, and what she told me was even worse than what Marcus and I had discovered. Not only were they planning to flee the country with my money, but they'd also discussed more extreme measures to ensure my cooperation. "They've been in contact with some very dangerous people," Natasha said, her eyes filling with tears. "Investors who don't accept losses gracefully. People who make threats when they don't get their money back." "What kind of threats?" "The kind that could put you in physical danger if they think you're standing between them and their money." She reached across the table and grabbed my hand. "Isabel, I know my family treated you terribly, but I can't let them hurt you. You need to get out of Phoenix today, and you need to make sure they never get access to your inheritance." As I sat there listening to my cousin detail the web of criminal activity and potential violence my family had created, I realized that this had gone far beyond a simple case of financial fraud. They weren't just thieves, they were desperate criminals who saw me as either their salvation or their biggest obstacle. And desperate criminals, as I was learning, were capable of almost anything. I left the cafe with Natasha's warnings echoing in my mind and hours of recorded evidence stored on Marcus's secure servers. Her revelation about dangerous investors had transformed this from a family dispute
into something potentially life-threatening. But if Harold and Claudia thought intimidation would make me more compliant, they were about to discover how wrong they were. Back at the hotel, Marcus was deep in conversation with someone on his encrypted phone line. He gestured for me to wait as he finished the call, his expression growing increasingly serious. "That was my contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit," he said after hanging up. "I've been sharing our findings with them, and they're very interested. They've actually had Brennan's strategic advisors on their radar for the past 6 months, based on complaints from several clients." "What does that mean for our investigation?" "It means we're not the only ones gathering evidence against your family, but it also means we need to be extremely careful. If they suspect they're under federal investigation, they might accelerate whatever timeline they're working with." As if summoned by his words, my phone rang. Claudia's name appeared on the screen, and something told me this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "Isabel, darling." Claudia's voice was sickeningly sweet, dripping with the false affection I remembered from childhood when she wanted something. "I hope you're feeling better after yesterday's misunderstanding. Sometimes emotions run high during family discussions." "What do you want, Claudia?" "Such hostility, dear. I'm calling because Harold and I would like to invite you to dinner tonight. Just family. We thought it might be nice to have a proper conversation about your inheritance and how we can all benefit from this wonderful opportunity your grandfather provided." The calculated way she phrased it, "your grandfather provided," as if she hadn't spent years dismissing his influence in my life, made my skin crawl. But I also recognized this as a chance to gather more information while they thought they were manipulating me. "That sounds lovely," I said, matching her fake sweetness. "Should I bring anything?" "Just an open mind and a willingness to consider what's best for the family." The subtle threat beneath her words was unmistakable. "We'll see you at 7. After she hung up, Marcus looked at me with concern. "You're not actually going to that dinner, are you?" "Of course I am." "But not alone." I pulled up my contacts and found the number Mrs. Ashford had given me. And not without backup. Mrs. Ashford answered on the second ring, and when I explained what was happening, she immediately offered to help. "I've been watching that family's machinations for months, dear. It's time someone held them accountable." We arranged for her to position herself where she could observe the house during dinner, ready to call for help if anything seemed wrong. Marcus would be monitoring from a van parked down the street, tracking my location through my phone, and recording everything through the wire I'd be wearing. "If anything feels off," Marcus insisted, "you get out immediately. Don't worry about being polite or maintaining cover. Your safety is more important than gathering evidence." At 6:45 p.m., I stood outside the Brennan house in a black dress that projected confidence while concealing the recording equipment Marcus had helped me attach. The same house where I'd spent my teenage years feeling like an unwelcome guest was now the stage for what might be my family's final performance. Claudia answered the door dressed as if this were a formal dinner party rather than a family discussion. Her smile was perfectly practiced, but her eyes held a coldness that reminded me why I'd been so eager to leave Phoenix 6 years ago. "Isabel, you look beautiful. Come in, come in." The dining room had been set with the good china, the same dishes that had been reserved for important guests when I was growing up, never used for ordinary family meals when I was present. Harold stood at the head of the table, looking more confident than he had since my arrival. Trevor and Natasha flanked him, both dressed as if this were a business presentation rather than a family dinner. Only one place setting remained empty, at the foot of the table, directly opposite Harold. The symbolism was not subtle. I was being positioned as the outsider again, the one who needed to be convinced to join their circle. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to the empty chair. "We have so much to discuss." Dinner conversation started innocuously enough. Questions about my business in Denver, polite inquiries about my flight, superficial comments about how much I'd changed since leaving home. But underneath the pleasantries, I could feel them studying me, assessing my responses, looking for weaknesses they could exploit.
It was Claudia who finally moved the conversation toward their real agenda, her approach as calculated as everything else about the evening. Isabel, we've been thinking about your inheritance situation, she began, cutting into her perfectly prepared salmon, and we realize we may have approached the topic incorrectly yesterday. Oh? I kept my voice neutral, encouraging her to continue.
We were so excited about the possibilities that we didn't take time to consider your perspective, your feelings about the family, your memories of living here. Her voice took on a tone of practiced remorse. I know I wasn't always as warm as I should have been when you were younger. The understatement was breathtaking, but I simply nodded as if considering her words. The truth is, Harold interjected, we miss having you as part of the family. Your success in Denver proves that you inherited the Walker entrepreneurial spirit, even if you got it through marriage rather than blood. Even now, even when they desperately needed me, they couldn't resist the casual cruelty. I wasn't really family, just someone who'd absorbed family traits through proximity. That's why we think this inheritance represents such a perfect opportunity, not just financially, but personally. A chance for you to come home, to be part of something meaningful, to finally take your rightful place in the family business. My rightful place, I repeated. And what would that be? Trevor leaned forward eagerly. We've been thinking about creating a new position, Vice President of Strategic Development. You'd have significant input into company direction, profit participation, real decision-making power. The offer was generous enough to sound tempting to someone who didn't know they were basically offering me a partnership in a criminal enterprise. But I played my part, asking questions about responsibilities and compensation as if I were genuinely considering it. Of course, the position would require your full participation, Harold said carefully, moving back to Phoenix, investing your inheritance as startup capital for the expanded operations, and committing to the long-term success of the family business. All of my inheritance? I asked, as if the amount concerned me rather than the principle. Well, naturally, we'd want to demonstrate your commitment to the venture. Investors respond well to family unity. Knowing that everyone has skin in the game creates confidence. The manipulation was masterful in its way. They were reframing my inheritance as an investment opportunity, their criminal enterprise as a family business, and my potential victimization as a homecoming. If I hadn't known what I knew, if I hadn't seen the evidence of their fraud, I might have been tempted by their vision of finally belonging. But I did know. And as they continued their carefully orchestrated presentation, complete with revised financial projections and glossy brochures for fake projects, I realized they'd made a critical error. They were so convinced of their own persuasive abilities that they were revealing details about their operation they should have kept hidden. Account numbers, client names, specific amounts that had been reinvested into new opportunities, all of it being recorded and transmitted to Marcus in real time. They thought they were seducing me into compliance, but they were actually providing evidence for their own prosecution. So, Harold said as dinner concluded, what do you think? Are you ready to come home and help us build something extraordinary together? I looked around the table at their expectant faces. Claudia's calculating smile, Harold's forced warmth, Trevor's barely contained desperation, and Natasha's guilty expression. My family, such as it was, waiting for my answer to a question that would determine all of our futures. I think, I said carefully, this sounds like exactly the kind of opportunity my grandfather would have wanted me to consider carefully. Can I have a few days to review everything before making a commitment? The relief in their expressions was palpable,
They thought I was wavering, that their manipulation was working. What they didn't realize was that I was buying time. Time for Marcus to complete his federal investigation, time for the FBI to build their case, and time for me to ensure that when justice came for the Brennan family, it would be swift, complete, and inescapable.
The morning after the dinner, I met with Marcus and his FBI contact, Special Agent Sarah Chen, at a secure location across town. Agent Chen was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in white-collar crime, and she'd been building a case against investment fraud schemes across the Southwest for the past 2 years. "Ms. Rivera," she said as we settled into a conference room at the federal building, "your family's operation is more sophisticated than most we encounter. They've been very careful about covering their tracks, which is why it's taken us months to gather sufficient evidence." "Until now," Marcus added, spreading out the documents we'd compiled. "Isabel's recordings from last night gave us the final pieces we needed. When Harold detailed those specific client accounts and how funds were redistributed, he essentially confessed to multiple federal crimes on tape." Agent Chen nodded grimly. "Wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud across state lines. We're looking at federal charges that could result in decades in prison for the primary conspirators." "What happens next?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Despite everything they'd done to me and their victims, these were still the people who'd raised me. "We need to coordinate a simultaneous action," Agent Chen explained. "Arrests, search warrants for their offices and homes, asset freezing orders to prevent them from moving money offshore. Based on your timeline, we have less than 10 days before your inheritance transfers and they potentially flee the country." The next week was a carefully choreographed dance of deception. I maintained regular contact with my family, playing the role of the conflicted heiress slowly being won over by their persuasive arguments. They interpreted my requests for more detailed financial information as signs that I was conducting due diligence before investing, never suspecting that every document they provided was being analyzed by federal investigators. Harold even invited me to observe a client meeting, eager to demonstrate the legitimacy of their operations. I sat in his office as he pitched the non-existent Desert Highlands Development Project to an elderly couple named the Washingtons, watching in real time as he defrauded them of their life savings with practiced charm and elaborate lies. "The guaranteed 15% return is based on our track record with similar projects," Harold told them, showing the same fake photographs Trevor had shown me. "Your investment will be secured by the property itself, so there's virtually no risk." Mrs. Washington looked uncertain. "It seems almost too good to be true, Harold. Are you sure this is safe?" "Martha, I've known your family for 20 years, Harold replied with perfect sincerity. "I wouldn't recommend anything I wouldn't invest in myself. In fact, my own family is putting significant money into this project." The casual mention of family investment, presumably referring to my inheritance, made my stomach turn. He was using me as an unknowing endorsement for his fraud, leveraging my supposed participation to convince these innocent people to hand over their retirement funds. The Washingtons signed the investment agreements that afternoon, writing a check for $200,000 that would disappear into the labyrinth of shell companies Harold used to hide stolen funds. As I watched them leave his office, smiling and excited about their financial future, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to compose myself. "Are you all right?" Harold asked when I returned, noting my pale complexion. "Just a bit overwhelmed," I lied. "It's a lot to process, seeing the business in action." "I understand, but you see how we operate, with integrity, transparency, always putting our clients' interests first." The casual way he delivered these lies while literally stealing from people would have been impressive if it weren't so monstrous. That evening, I called Agent Chen from my hotel room. "I can't watch this anymore. When are you making the arrests?" "Soon," she assured me. "We're coordinating with multiple agencies to ensure we catch everyone simultaneously. Your family has been very careful about compartmentalizing their operations, so we need to move on all fronts at once." The next morning brought a new escalation. Claudia called with barely contained excitement in her voice. "Isabel, wonderful news. We've had a major breakthrough with one of our investment opportunities. There's a chance for us to accelerate your involvement in the business." What kind of breakthrough? A client has decided to increase their investment significantly, but they want to meet you first. They're specifically interested in your architectural background for a development project. It's exactly the kind of high-profile opportunity that could establish your reputation in Phoenix business circles. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon at an upscale restaurant downtown. As I prepared to leave the hotel, Marcus called with urgent news.
Don't go to that meeting, he said without preamble. We've identified the client your aunt mentioned. His name is Viktor Kozlov, and he's not a legitimate investor. He's a money launderer with connections to organized crime in Eastern Europe. My blood ran cold. You think this is connected to the dangerous investors Natasha warned me about? I think your family is more desperate than we realized. If they're bringing in someone like Kozlov, it means they're running out of legitimate options for raising money. Marcus's voice was tense. This meeting could be an attempt to pressure you through intimidation or worse. So what do? We accelerate our timeline. I'm calling Agent Chen now to move up the arrests. Your family has crossed a line by involving organized crime figures. 2 hours later, Agent Chen called with the final operational details. Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., we execute simultaneous raids on Brennan's strategic advisors' offices, the family home, and Harold's personal residence. We'll have teams in place to prevent any destruction of evidence or attempts to flee. What about me? What should I do? Stay in your hotel until we give you the all clear. Once the arrests are made, we'll need you to provide formal statements and testimony. But Miss Rivera, her voice grew serious, you should know that this will likely destroy any remaining relationship with your family. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the Washingtons, walking out of Harold's office with smiles on their faces and fraud documents in their hands. I thought about all the other victims whose retirement savings had been stolen to fund my family's luxury lifestyle. I thought about the years of emotional manipulation and conditional love that had shaped my understanding of family loyalty. Agent Chen, I said, my family destroyed our relationship years ago. Tomorrow, we're just making it official. That night, I sat on my hotel balcony looking out at the Phoenix lights, knowing it would be the last time I saw the city as someone with family here. By tomorrow evening, Harold, Claudia, and Trevor would be in federal custody, their crimes exposed, their victims finally getting justice. I called Mrs. Ashford to let her know what was coming. I'm proud of you, dear, she said gently. Your grandfather would be proud too. He always said you had more integrity in your little finger than the rest of that family had combined. I hope I'm doing the right thing. You're stopping criminals from hurting more innocent people. There's nothing more right than that. As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with one final text from Trevor. Looking forward to having you as a real partner in the family business, Izzy. Tomorrow starts a new chapter for all of us. He was right about tomorrow starting a new chapter, but it wouldn't be the one he was expecting. In 12 hours, federal agents would simultaneously raid every aspect of the Brennan family operation. The new chapter would be written in arrest warrants and criminal indictments, not investment portfolios and offshore accounts. And for the first time since that fake emergency call had dragged me back to Phoenix, I would finally be free of my family's manipulation forever.
At 7:30 a.m., my phone rang with a call from Agent Chen. We're in position. All teams are ready to execute simultaneously. Are you secure in your hotel? Yes, I'm ready. Remember, stay inside until we give you the all clear. Your family may try to contact you once they realize what's happening. Do not answer any calls or texts until we've completed the operation. At exactly 8 a.m., federal agents across Phoenix began executing the largest white-collar crime raid in the city's recent history. From my hotel window, I couldn't see any of the action, but I knew that teams were simultaneously hitting Brennan's strategic advisors' offices, Harold and Claudia's home, Trevor's apartment, and several safe deposit boxes the family maintained under various business names. My phone started buzzing at 8:03 a.m. First Trevor, then Harold, then Claudia. When I didn't answer, the calls became more frequent and desperate. Text messages flooded in. Isabel, something's happening at the office. Call me immediately, Trevor. FBI agents are here with warrants. We need to talk now, Harold.
Isabel, this is all a misunderstanding. Please call your uncle immediately. Claudia. The progression of confusion to panic to desperation played out in real time through their messages. I watched their world collapse through the screen of my phone, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and unexpected sadness. Despite everything they'd done, seeing their panic still triggered the complicated emotions of someone who'd shared a home with these people for 13 years. At 9:15 a.m., Agent Chen called with an update. We've secured all locations and arrested Harold, Claudia, and Trevor without incident. We're currently processing evidence from their offices and residences. Can you meet us at the Brennan house in an hour? We'd like you to walk through the scene with us. Driving to the house where I'd grown up, flanked by FBI vehicles and crime scene tape, felt surreal. The neighborhood was in chaos. News vans, curious neighbors, and federal agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the pristine home where Claudia had hosted so many dinner parties and charity events. Agent Chen met me at the front door where federal agents were photographing and cataloging evidence. "We found exactly what you predicted," she said grimly. "Offshore account setup documents, fake investment prospectuses, client lists with fabricated return statements, and enough evidence to prosecute this case for years." Where are they now? Harold and Trevor are being processed at the Federal Detention Center. Claudia is at the hospital. She had what appears to be a panic attack when agents served the warrant. She'll be formally arrested once she's medically cleared. We walked through the house as Agent Chen explained what they'd discovered. Harold's home office contained 3 safes filled with cash, precious metals, and documents detailing the family's criminal operations. Claudia's walk-in closet revealed jewelry and designer items worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, all purchased with stolen client funds. Most shocking was Trevor's bedroom, which had been converted into a command center for their fraud operation. Multiple computers, burner phones, and detailed charts tracking which clients had invested in which fake projects. On his desk, agents had found a notebook containing what appeared to be escape plans, including flight schedules to non-extradition countries and instructions for accessing offshore accounts. They were planning to disappear within days, Agent Chen said, showing me the notebook. Your inheritance transfer would have funded their escape, leaving all their victims with nothing. In the dining room where we'd had that manipulative dinner just days earlier, agents had found the most damning evidence of all: recorded conversations. Harold had been secretly recording client meetings, presumably as insurance against future legal problems, but the recordings instead documented years of systematic fraud. "Listen to this," Agent Chen said, playing a clip on her tablet. Harold's voice filled the room, clearly audible as he coached Trevor on how to manipulate elderly clients. Appeal to their trust in family values. Make them feel like they're not just investing money, they're joining something special. Fear of missing out is more powerful than greed. Hearing him discuss fraud tactics in the same clinical way he'd once helped me with math homework was deeply disturbing. This wasn't a good man who'd made bad choices. This was someone who'd systematically targeted vulnerable people for years. My phone buzzed with a call from the detention center. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Isabel." Harold's voice was strained, desperate. "Thank God you picked up. There's been a terrible mistake. We need you to call our lawyer. Get us out of here so we can straighten this all out." "There is no mistake. I know exactly what you've been doing." "What are you talking about? This is some kind of misunderstanding with regulatory paperwork. We run a legitimate business." "I've seen the evidence. I know about the Ponzi scheme, the fake investments, the stolen client funds. I know about Viktor Kozlov and your plans to flee the country with my inheritance."
The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Harold spoke again, his voice had changed completely, cold, calculating, and filled with venom. "You little bitch. You think you're so smart, so righteous? We gave you everything. We took you in when nobody else wanted you, raised you, paid for your education, and this is how you repay us? You gave me a roof over my head and reminded me every day that I should be grateful for scraps from your table. The only thing you gave me freely was the knowledge that family loyalty is conditional. You have no idea what you've done. Our clients trusted us. Their investments. Their investments are gone, Harold. You spent their retirement money on luxury cars and designer clothes and fake business trips. You've destroyed dozens of families to fund your lifestyle. Those people were fine until you brought the FBI into this. We could have made everyone whole again with your inheritance money. The casual way he blamed me for exposing their crimes rather than acknowledging any responsibility for committing them perfectly encapsulated everything wrong with the Brennan family worldview. Even now, facing federal charges and decades in prison, Harold couldn't accept that his actions had consequences. "Goodbye, Harold," I said, and hung up. Agent Chen had been listening to the call. He'll likely contact you again, either directly or through other family members. It's important that you don't engage. These kinds of cases often involve extensive intimidation attempts. What about Natasha? Was she arrested too? We're still evaluating her level of involvement. She's cooperating with our investigation and may face lesser charges in exchange for testimony against the primary conspirators. As we finished the walkthrough, Agent Chen handed me a thick folder. These are victim impact statements from some of your family's clients. You don't have to read them now, but when you're ready, they'll help you understand the full scope of what you've helped us stop. I took the folder, knowing I'd need to read every page eventually. The people whose lives had been destroyed by my family's greed deserved to have their stories acknowledged. "Ms. Rivera," Agent Chen said as we prepared to leave, "I want you to know that what you did took incredible courage. Most people wouldn't have been able to turn in their own family, regardless of the circumstances. Most people probably had better families than I did." As I drove away from the house where I'd spent my teenage years, I passed neighbors I recognized from childhood, people who'd known me as the quiet, grateful girl living with the successful Brennan family. Now they knew the truth about what had been happening behind those perfectly manicured walls. My phone rang one more time as I reached the hotel. This call was from Natasha, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Isabel, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it. I should have stopped them years ago." "What happens now, Natasha?" "I'm going to testify against them. All of them. It's the only way to make any of this right." She paused. "I know we can never be a real family after this, but I want you to know that you did the right thing. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone in my family had acknowledged that justice mattered more than loyalty. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. The Brennan family name that once represented success and respectability in Phoenix would now be synonymous with fraud and betrayal. And, for the first time in my life, I was proud not to really be one of them.
3 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse watching Harold, Claudia, and Trevor enter their guilty pleas before Judge Patricia Martinez. The courtroom was packed with victims, media, and legal observers who'd followed what the Phoenix Business Journal had dubbed the most comprehensive investment fraud case in Arizona history. The months between their arrests and this moment had been a whirlwind of depositions, testimony, and legal proceedings. The FBI's investigation had uncovered even more victims than we'd initially discovered. Over 300 individuals and families who'd lost a combined $47 million to the Brennan family's elaborate schemes. Harold stepped forward first, flanked by his court-appointed attorney. The man who'd once commanded respect in Phoenix business circles now looked diminished and defeated. His expensive suits had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, and his confident demeanor had crumbled under the weight of overwhelming evidence. "Harold James Brennan," Judge Martinez read from the charges, "you are pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and operating a continuing financial crimes enterprise. Do you understand that these charges carry a maximum sentence of 85 years in federal prison?" "Yes, Your Honor." Harold's voice was barely audible.
And do you understand that by entering this guilty plea, you are admitting to systematically defrauding clients of Brennan's strategic advisors over a period of 5 years, misappropriating approximately $47 million in client funds for personal use and to perpetuate fraudulent investment schemes? Yes, Your Honor. Watching this moment, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but also sadness for the man who'd once helped me with homework and taught me to drive. The Harold I'd known had been flawed and distant, but not evil. This version of him, the calculating criminal who'd stolen from retirees and charitable organizations, felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. Claudia's plea hearing was even more difficult to watch. She'd lost significant weight during her 3 months in custody, and her usually perfect appearance had given way to a gaunt, hollow-eyed look that spoke to the stress of facing decades in prison. Claudia Marie Brennan, Judge Martinez continued, you are pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit securities fraud and money laundering. Do you understand that these charges carry a maximum sentence of 40 years in federal prison? Yes. Claudia's yes was barely a whisper, and she swayed slightly as she spoke. Her attorney steadied her with a gentle hand on her arm. Trevor's hearing was the most painful for me personally. Despite everything he'd done, he was still the cousin who'd taught me to ride a bike and defended me from bullies at school. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. He'd been the architect of many of their most sophisticated fraud schemes, using his business education to create shell companies and false documentation that had fooled both clients and regulatory agencies. Trevor Michael Brennan, Judge Martinez continued, you are pleading guilty to conspiracy to commit securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and identity theft related to the creation of fraudulent business entities. Do you understand that these charges carry a maximum sentence of 70 years in federal prison? Trevor had aged years in the months since his arrest. The cocky businessman who tried to sell me on fake investment opportunities now looked broken and defeated. When he answered the judge, his voice cracked with emotion. After the guilty pleas were entered, the court moved to victim impact statements. I dreaded this part of the proceedings, knowing that I'd hear directly from the people my family had destroyed. The first to speak was Martha Washington, the elderly woman I'd watched Harold defraud with his Desert Highlands development project lives. She was helped to the podium by her husband, and when she began to speak, her voice shook with a mixture of grief and anger. Your Honor, my husband and I worked for 43 years to save the money Harold Brennan stole from us. We trusted him because he was recommended by friends, because he was a pillar of the community, because he looked us in the eyes and promised our money would be safe. She paused to compose herself, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. We lost $200,000, money that we saved to leave to our grandchildren, money that we needed for medical expenses as we age. Harold Brennan didn't just steal our savings, he stole our children's inheritance and our security in our final years. One by one, dozens of victims shared their stories. Retirees who lost their life savings, small business owners who'd invested their company's capital and lost everything, young families who'd trusted the Brennans with college funds for their children. Each story was a reminder of why I'd made the choice to expose my family's crimes. These weren't nameless victims or abstract financial losses. They were real people whose lives had been devastated by my family's greed and manipulation. When the victim statements concluded, Judge Martinez addressed the defendants before pronouncing sentences.
The crimes you committed represent a profound betrayal of trust, she said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. You preyed upon the elderly, the vulnerable, and the trusting. You used your positions of respect in this community to systematically steal from people who considered you friends and advisors. Harold received 25 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for a man in his 60s. Claudia was sentenced to 15 years. Trevor, whose cooperation with investigators had earned him some consideration, received 12 years, but would be eligible for parole in 8. As they were led away in shackles, none of them looked in my direction. I'd become a non-entity to them, someone whose betrayal of family loyalty was unforgivable regardless of the justice it had served. After the sentencing, I met with Agent Chen and Marcus in the courthouse hallway. The investigation had concluded successfully, with the FBI recovering nearly $30 million in stolen assets that would be distributed to victims through a court-supervised restitution fund. "It's not everything," Agent Chen acknowledged, "but it's more than most fraud victims ever recover. Your cooperation made the difference between a partial recovery and complete loss for hundreds of families." Marcus handed me a final report detailing the resolution of the case. The Victims' Restitution Fund will be managed by an independent trustee. Your grandfather's inheritance, since it was never commingled with the fraudulent accounts, remains completely intact and available to you as originally intended. The irony wasn't lost on me. The money my family had desperately tried to steal to fund their escape was now free and clear, protected by the same legal mechanisms my grandfather had put in place to keep it safe from their potential mismanagement. Outside the courthouse, I was approached by several journalists wanting statements about the case and my role in exposing my family's crimes. I declined most interviews, but I did agree to speak with a reporter from the Phoenix Business Journal who'd been covering the story from the beginning. "Do you regret turning in your family?" she asked as cameras rolled. I thought carefully before answering. I regret that they chose to commit these crimes. I regret that innocent people were hurt by their actions, but I don't regret stopping them from hurting more people. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that family loyalty has limits. What's next for you? I'm going back to Denver to rebuild my life and my business, but I'm also establishing a foundation to help fraud victims and support financial literacy education. If we can prevent even one family from going through what these victims experienced, then something good will have come from this tragedy. As I left the courthouse that day, I carried with me the satisfaction of seeing justice served and the knowledge that dozens of families would recover at least part of what had been stolen from them. But I also carried the grief of losing the only family I'd ever known, even if they'd never truly accepted me as one of them. The little girl who'd once desperately wanted to belong to the Brennan family was finally free from their influence forever. And for the first time in my life, that freedom felt like a gift rather than a loss. 2 years after the courthouse sentencing, I stood in the lobby of the Rivera Community Foundation's new headquarters in downtown Denver, watching volunteers prepare for our annual fraud prevention conference. The building itself was a converted warehouse that I'd redesigned, combining my architectural background with the foundation's mission to create a space that felt both professional and welcoming to people who'd been betrayed by financial institutions. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined. What started as a way to channel my inheritance toward helping fraud victims had evolved into a comprehensive organization providing financial literacy education, victim advocacy services, and support for white-collar crime investigations across the Southwest. Isabel, the Phoenix Victims Group just arrived, called Marcus Webb, who'd left his federal consulting work to serve as the foundation's director of investigations. "Mrs. Washington is asking for you specifically." I walked toward the conference registration area, where I spotted Martha Washington immediately. Now 81, and moving with the help of a walker, she still carried herself with the dignity I remembered from the courthouse. Her husband had passed away the previous year, but she'd continued attending our events and had become one of our most effective speakers about the human impact of financial fraud. "Mrs. Washington," I said, embracing her gently, "I'm so glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it, dear. Though I have to say, seeing this place always amazes me. To think that something this beautiful came from something so ugly." She gestured around the lobby where photographs of financial fraud victims and their recovery stories lined the walls alongside information about financial protection resources. "Have you heard any news about the family?" she asked, her voice careful. She was one of the few people who understood the complicated emotions I still carried about Harold, Claudia, and Trevor. "Claudia was released to a halfway house last month," I said. Her sentence was reduced for good behavior and cooperation with ongoing investigations into other financial fraud cases. Harold and Trevor are still incarcerated, with no possibility of parole for several more years. What I didn't mention was that Claudia had written to me twice since her release, letters that remained unopened in my desk drawer. I wasn't ready for whatever apologies or explanations she might offer, and I wasn't sure I ever would be. The conference that day brought together nearly 200 fraud victims, law enforcement officials, and financial professionals. I gave the opening keynote, sharing my story not as Isabel Rivera, the successful architect, but as the woman who discovered that the people she'd considered family were systematically destroying other families for profit. The hardest part wasn't exposing their crimes. It was accepting that my desire to belong to a family had blinded me to the kind of people they really were. But I learned that real family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about people who support your growth, celebrate your successes, and stand by you when you do the right thing, even when it's difficult. After my speech, I was approached by a young man in his 20s who looked nervous but determined. "Miss Rivera, my name is David Kozlov. I think my father might have been involved with your family's business." The name hit me like ice water. Victor Kozlov, the organized crime figure who'd been scheduled to meet with me before the FBI raids. I'd wondered what had happened to that connection, but investigations had been classified above my clearance level. "My father disappeared right around the time your family was arrested. The FBI questioned me, but I didn't know anything about his business dealings. I'm trying to understand what happened, and I thought maybe you could help me make sense of it." I looked at this young man, probably close to my age, with the same haunted expression I'd carried for months after discovering my family's true nature. "Let's find somewhere private to talk." We spent an hour in my office as David told me about growing up with a father whose business dealings were mysterious and frightening, about the expensive gifts and lavish lifestyle that never quite made sense, about the fear that had always lurked beneath the surface of their family dynamics. "The worst part," he said, "is wondering if I benefited from money that was stolen from people like the victims here today. If my college education, my car, my apartment were all paid for with blood money." I recognized his struggle intimately. "David, you can't control what your father did or where the money came from, but you can control what you do with that knowledge moving forward." "What do you mean?" "Get involved. Learn about financial crimes, victim advocacy, fraud prevention. Use your experience to help other people avoid being victimized. Transform your pain into purpose."
6 months later, David Kozlov joined the Rivera Foundation as a volunteer coordinator, bringing a unique perspective on the children of white-collar criminals and organized crime figures. His father was eventually arrested in Bulgaria and extradited to face charges related to money laundering, but David had found his own path toward redemption. The Foundation's work expanded internationally as we connected with similar organizations across North America and Europe. We developed educational programs for high schools and colleges, teaching young people to recognize and avoid investment fraud schemes. We lobbied for stronger consumer protections and supported legislation requiring more transparency in financial services marketing. But perhaps the most meaningful work came through our victim support groups, where people who'd been betrayed by trusted financial advisors could find community and healing. Watching Martha Washington comfort a recently widowed man who'd lost his pension to a cryptocurrency scam reminded me that my grandfather's inheritance had found its true purpose, not funding family luxury or business expansion, but rebuilding lives that had been shattered by betrayal. On quiet evenings in my Denver apartment, I sometimes thought about the alternate timeline where I'd given my family my inheritance, where their Ponzi scheme had continued for years before inevitably collapsing, where hundreds more families would have lost everything while Harold, Claudia, and Trevor lived luxuriously in non-extradition countries. I also thought about Natasha, who'd served 8 months in federal prison before being released to community service. She'd moved to Portland and started working with a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated individuals reintegrate into society. We exchanged brief emails occasionally, not exactly reconciliation, but acknowledgement that we'd both chosen difficult paths toward redemption. Mrs. Ashford, now 85 and still sharp as ever, had become the foundation's unofficial grandmother figure, attending every event and serving on our advisory board. She often reminded me that my grandfather would be proud of what I'd built from the ashes of his family's crimes. Antonio always said you had the strongest moral compass of anyone in that family, she told me during one of our regular dinners. He set up that trust not just to give you financial security, but to ensure you'd have the independence to follow your conscience no matter what pressure others might apply. As I reflected on the journey from that desperate phone call 2 years ago to this moment, I realized that losing my family had been the price of finding myself. The desperate girl who'd once craved acceptance from people who saw her as either a burden or an opportunity had grown into a woman who understood that the most important approval was her own. My inheritance had been protected from my family's crimes, but more importantly, I had been protected from becoming complicit in them. The money my grandfather left me had become a tool for justice, rather than a source of corruption, helping hundreds of fraud victims rebuild their lives while funding education programs that would prevent future crimes. The phone call that had seemed like the worst moment of my life had ultimately led to the best decision I'd ever made. And in choosing justice over family loyalty, I'd finally found the belonging I'd been searching for all along, not with people who shared my blood, but with people who shared my values. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you're meant to belong to. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what really matters. And sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that love and loyalty must have limits, especially when they're being used as weapons against innocent people. I was no longer the unwanted niece who'd never quite belonged to the Brennan family. I was Isabel Rivera, survivor, advocate, and architect of a better future for fraud victims everywhere. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough.